In the spring of 1841, deep in the wooded valleys of northern Tennessee, a discovery was unearthed that would forever alter our understanding of human depravity. 42 children, aged between 5 and 17, were found shackled in a cellar beneath a seemingly unremarkable cabin. The children, with no apparent connection to one another, spoke in varied tongues and dialects, and when questioned, could only murmur one name through their sobs: Mother Hawthorne. The local constable's report, hidden for decades in the Claiborne County records, detailed horrors so grotesque that 2 of the investigating deputies left their posts within days. What makes this case so unsettling isn't merely the atrocities uncovered, but the chilling fact that Abigail Hawthorne had run her sinister operation for nearly 25 years without arousing suspicion. The children called her mother, but the truth behind that title was far darker than anyone could fathom. Before we delve deeper into the Hawthorne family's unspeakable crimes, I want to ask you something. This channel isn't for the faint of heart, only for those daring enough to face the bleakest corners of American history. If you're still here, you're different. You know some truths are too horrific to turn away from, no matter how much they unsettle us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of fearless truth seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear tales like this from your own neck of the woods? The question that baffled investigators then and still puzzles historians today is how such a vast scheme could go unnoticed in a tight-knit rural community. The Tennessee of 1841 was a region straddling old and new. The fading frontier lifestyle clashed with murmurs of progress creeping in from the east. In this setting, the small settlement of Pine Hollow, home to perhaps 60 families scattered across the misty ridges of Claiborne County, was a typical rural outpost. Most residents grew wheat or barley, bartered at Grayson's trading post, and gathered for events at the log-built chapel that also served as a town hall. The Hawthorne property lay on the edge of this community, a modest one-story cabin surrounded by 150 acres of fertile land. To any passerby on the rutted trail linking Pine Hollow to Knoxville, the Hawthorne homestead seemed entirely ordinary. The cabin, constructed in the simple pioneer style of the 1810s, had weathered gray siding and a narrow front porch, common in Tennessee's backcountry. A small barn stood 50 yards behind, flanked by a hog pen and a drying shed, completing the standard farm layout. What set the Hawthorne property apart wasn't visible from the trail. Amos Hawthorne, who had claimed the land in 1815 with funds from his father's lumber trade, had invested heavily in expanding the cabin's cellar. Unlike the shallow storage pits typical of Tennessee homes, the Hawthorne cellar stretched far beyond the cabin's footprint. Local laborers recalled being hired for digging projects through the 1810s and 1830s, though none saw the finished work. Amos paid generously in coin, insisting workers focus only on their specific tasks. Abigail Hawthorne, Amos's wife, arrived in Pine Hollow in 1816 as a bride of 21. Neighbors described her as a striking woman with auburn hair and a quiet, almost melodic voice. She dressed plainly but with care, attended Baptist services when her health allowed, and was known for her acts of kindness. When asked to support local causes, Abigail would explain that she and Amos were already caring for several orphaned children from her kin in Ohio. These children, she said, were staying temporarily until permanent homes could be arranged. This story quelled curiosity about the occasional sightings of children on the Hawthorne land. Mrs. Grayson, who ran the trading post, sometimes noticed a small face peering from the Hawthorne cart when Abigail came for supplies. The children were silent, and Abigail would say they were timid, shaken by the loss of their families, and needed time to heal. In an era of rampant disease and early death, Pine Hollow's residents accepted this without skepticism. Elijah Grayson, the trading post owner, later noted that Abigail was a steady customer. Every 10 days, she arrived with a precise list and ample cash to buy large amounts of staples: oats, dried beans, salt, bacon, and honey. The quantities seemed excessive for a couple without children, but when Elijah commented, Abigail reminded him of the orphans. She also bought unusual quantities of salves and tonics, claiming the children often arrived sickly from their troubled pasts. The Hawthorne farm followed an odd rhythm that puzzled some neighbors. While most families worked from dawn to dusk, activity at the Hawthorne place often stretched late into the night. Lanterns glowed in the cabin windows at strange hours, and the faint sound of digging or carpentry sometimes carried through the valley after dark. When questioned, Amos said he was building additions to house the growing number of children in their care. Dr. Caleb Thornton, the itinerant physician serving Pine Hollow, recalled visiting the Hawthorne farm several times in the 1820s and 1830s. Each visit was for a reportedly sick orphan, but Dr. Thornton was never allowed to see the children. Abigail would describe their symptoms and request specific remedies. When he pressed to examine his patients, she'd say the children were too fearful of strangers, too scarred by their pasts to tolerate unfamiliar faces. The deception was so thorough that even the local preacher, Reverend Jonah Tate, believed in the Hawthornes' benevolence. During his rare visits to the farm, he commended Abigail and Amos for their godly work in sheltering so many lost souls. He offered to help place the orphans, but Abigail assured him she was already arranging homes with kin in Ohio, a process that required time and delicacy. What no one in Pine Hollow suspected was that Abigail Hawthorne had honed her ruse for over 2 decades. The orphan children weren't temporary guests awaiting loving homes. They were captives, stolen, purchased, or coerced from families across several states, held in conditions that would horrify even the most jaded soul. The unraveling of the Hawthorne family's gruesome secrets began with a string of seemingly unrelated events in early 1841. January had been brutally cold, with temperatures plunging far below freezing for weeks. This bitter Tennessee winter would prove both a curse and a salvation for the 42 children trapped beneath the Hawthorne cabin. On January 19, 1841, a peddler named Isaiah Walsh, traveling from Knoxville to Morristown, was caught in a fierce blizzard. The Hawthorne cabin, the nearest shelter visible from the trail, seemed an obvious refuge. Amos Hawthorne, though visibly hesitant, could scarcely deny aid to a stranded traveler in such perilous weather. Walsh later described the night as deeply unnerving. Abigail served a meager meal of biscuits and smoked ham, but the conversation was strained. The Hawthornes seemed anxious, exchanging wary glances and flinching at every creak. When Walsh inquired about the children he'd heard lived there, Abigail said they were asleep and couldn't be disturbed, recovering from a recent illness. What troubled Walsh most was a sound, faint, muffled whimpering from beneath the floorboards. When he mentioned it to Amos the next morning, Hawthorne dismissed it as wind rattling the cellars loose. Stones, common in old cabins during storms. Walsh wasn't convinced but left uneasy. The second incident came 3 weeks later, on February 12th. Eliza O'Connell, a young Scottish immigrant traveling with her siblings to find work in Knoxville's mills, was separated from her group during a fog-choked river crossing. Cold and lost, she stumbled to the Hawthorne cabin as night fell. Abigail took her in, offering warmth and a bed. Eliza O'Connell was never seen alive again. When her siblings reported her disappearance to the Knoxville constable, they described her last known path. A search was mounted, but the dense Tennessee wilderness made it futile. After 10 days, Eliza was presumed dead from exposure or animal attack. The final incident, which would lead to the discovery, occurred on March 8, 1841. On March 8, 1841, a local farmer named Ezekiel Ramsey was tracking deer in the dense woods bordering the Hawthorne property when a sound froze him in his tracks. From the direction of the Hawthorne cabin came the unmistakable wail of children, not the playful shouts of youth, but raw, anguished screams of terror. Ramsey edged closer, concealing himself behind a cluster of pine trees roughly 40 yards from the cabin. For over an hour, he watched and listened. The screams rose and fell, always seeming to emanate from beneath the cabin rather than within it. At one point, he saw Amos Hawthorne emerge from a low cellar door on the side of the house. Amos scanned the surroundings with a tense expression before slipping back underground. When Ramsey shared his observations with neighbors, opinions split. Some suggested the orphaned children Abigail mentioned might be more troubled than the Hawthornes let on, perhaps needing strict discipline or medical care that could sound distressing. Others began recalling oddities they'd overlooked. The large quantities of supplies Abigail purchased, the faint hammering sounds heard at night, and the fact that none of these supposed orphans ever appeared at church or town gatherings. Constable Nathaniel Burke, a seasoned lawman who'd served Claiborne County for 12 years, initially brushed off the concerns as idle talk. But when Ezekiel Ramsey insisted on filing a formal complaint, Burke relented. The law required him to investigate claims of potential child mistreatment, regardless of his skepticism. On the morning of March 14, 1841, Constable Burke rode to the Hawthorne farm with his deputy, Silas Reed, expecting a routine visit to quell the rumors. Abigail Hawthorne greeted them at the door, her demeanor warm and composed. She invited them in for tea, expressing dismay at the community's gossip. The conversation started pleasantly. Abigail reiterated her story about the orphaned children, showing letters she claimed were from kin in Ohio, and offered to arrange a meeting with the children once they recovered from a recent fever. All seemed plausible until Deputy Reed asked to use the outhouse. As Reed circled the cabin, he noticed something chilling. The cellar door Ramsay had described was secured with 4 heavy padlocks, with thick chains looped through the handles. The wood around the locks bore deep scratches, as if someone had clawed desperately from the inside. Reed returned and whispered his findings to Burke. Both men realized this was no mere rumor. Burke calmly asked Abigail to show them the cellar, explaining it would help dispel the community's concerns. Abigail's composure shattered. Her face paled, her hands shook, and she stammered that the cellar was unsafe, used only for storing old tools and off-limits to the children. Then they heard it, a faint, muffled sob from beneath the floor, followed by a weak plea for help, unmistakable from directly under the parlor where they stood. The aftermath of that moment would haunt Constable Burke for years. When he and Reed pried open the cellar door, a foul stench surged upward, a sickening blend of filth, sweat, and what Burke later called the odor of hopelessness. The cellar Amos had expanded over decades was a monument to calculated cruelty. The main chamber stretched far beyond the cabin's foundation, a subterranean maze of stone walls, meticulously sealed to stifle sound. It opened into interconnected rooms, the largest directly beneath the parlor. There, chained to iron rings bolted into the walls, were most of the children, 42 in total, aged roughly 5 to 17. Their ankles were bound by shackles, the chains just long enough for limited movement, but short enough to prevent escape. Emaciated, clad in tattered rags, their bodies bore scars of neglect and abuse. Many showed signs of fever, lung ailments, or skin infections from the damp, airless space. Most harrowing was their silence. After the initial cries, they stared at the officers with hollow, hopeless eyes, as if rescue was unimaginable. Deputy Reed, a father of 3, retched repeatedly and had to step outside. Constable Burke, despite his experience, struggled to comprehend the scene. The scale of the captivity, the evidence of meticulous planning, and the sheer number of victims overwhelmed him. In smaller chambers, they found tools of control, a room with wooden stocks and restraints for punishment, another with crude medical supplies, not for care, but to keep the children alive for whatever purpose the Hawthornes intended. A third room held meticulous records, names, ages, arrival dates, and notes on each child's health and behavior. The records revealed the operation's scope. Since 1816, shortly after Abigail's arrival in Pine Hollow, children had been brought to the farm. Some were bought from overcrowded poorhouses, others were runaways promised shelter, and many were simply abducted from distant towns. The ledgers documented over 80 children passing through the cellar. The chilling question, where were the others, was answered in a hidden chamber, accessible only by crawling through a narrow tunnel. There, Burke and Reed found the remains of at least 30 children, buried in shallow graves beneath the dirt floor, dusted with lime to mask the smell of decay. Some had died of disease or starvation, others bore marks of violence. The investigation that followed stretched for months as authorities grappled with how such a vast crime had gone undetected for so long. Abigail Hawthorne's cunning was the key. She had crafted a flawless persona, a pious woman caring for orphans, perfectly tailored to Pine Hollow's Christian values. Her story of traumatized children too shy to be seen explained their absence from public life. Claims of arranging homes with Ohio relatives justified why the children never left. She trained them to call her mother, so any overheard cries seemed familial. The rare glimpses of children were choreographed, coached to act withdrawn, not terrified. Her practical measures were equally shrewd. Food and medicine purchases were justified by the orphans' supposed needs. The cellar's construction, spread across years with different workers, ensured no one grasped its true purpose. Soundproofing muffled most cries, and any stray noises were dismissed as farm work or children at play. Abigail's psychological control was chillingly effective. She convinced the children their families had abandoned them, that the outside world was hostile. Compliant children received slightly better food. Troublemakers faced brutal punishments as warnings to others. Over time, most accepted their imprisonment as their reality. Pine Hollow reeled in disbelief. Many refused to accept that Abigail, their quiet neighbor of 25 years, could commit such atrocities. Some speculated Amos coerced her, or that it was all a mistake. But the evidence was undeniable. The records included coded letters linking Abigail to a trafficking network spanning Tennessee to New York. She corresponded with at least 10 figures across 4 states, discussing shipments and stock quality, in terms clearly referring to children. One letter, dated December 1840, from a carver in Albany, offered 5 new pieces, mixed ages, ready for your specifications. The letter from Carver included precise descriptions of the children, their estimated ages, physical health, and most disturbingly their dispositions, noting which were docile and which might need further conditioning. The financial ledgers uncovered an even bleaker reality. Abigail Hawthorne had paid between $40 and $150 per child, depending on their age and strength. She also received payments from other sources, indicating the Hawthorne cabin was both a holding site and a hub for redistributing trafficked children. The total sum involved was staggering for the era, over $6,500 across 25 years, equivalent to hundreds of thousands in today's currency. Dr. Caleb Thornton, the itinerant physician who had visited the Hawthorne farm multiple times, became a critical witness as the investigation deepened. Under questioning, he admitted Abigail had always been unusually precise about the remedies she requested, showing knowledge of treating malnutrition, fevers, and infections prevalent in severely neglected children. She had also asked for sedatives and drugs that could subdue resistant captives. Thornton's testimony revealed a chilling truth. Abigail had methodically studied how to sustain large groups of children in extreme deprivation. Her medical purchases, her questions, and the cellar's design were all engineered to maximize survival with minimal resources. Elijah Grayson, the Trading Post owner, provided further evidence. His sales records showed Abigail's purchases of staples, oats, beans, and bacon, had grown over the years. What seemed like the needs of a charitable household was proof of an expanding operation. Grayson recalled odd requests, extra quilts, bulk children's clothing, and large quantities of basic salves, which he'd overlooked at the time. The investigation also clarified Amos Hawthorne's role. While Abigail was the mastermind, Amos handled the cellar's upkeep and the children's discipline. Surviving victims, when they could finally speak, described him as the enforcer, delivering punishments and maintaining order. His construction work wasn't mere expansion, but ongoing refinements to a system built for human captivity. The most harrowing insight came from the ledger's records of children who vanished from the farm. Some were marked as relocated to other sites, hinting at a network of buyers and sellers across states. Others were labeled unfit or disruptive, entries that matched the remains found in the burial chamber. As authorities in Ohio, Kentucky, Virginia, and Alabama investigated their own missing children cases, patterns emerged. Many victims were poor, orphaned, or from families too destitute to pursue them, mirroring those found at the Hawthorne farm. Federal marshals were summoned to coordinate the multi-state investigation, a rare move in 1841, when law enforcement was typically local. The Hawthorne case marked one of the first major criminal probes to span state lines and involve federal oversight. Legal complexities arose as the crimes crossed jurisdictions with varying laws. As months passed, survivors began sharing their stories, their accounts chillingly consistent. They described years of confinement, systematic abuse, and psychological manipulation. New arrivals were broken through isolation, starvation, and indoctrination until they submitted. A hierarchy existed among the captives, with older children granted small privileges, like extra scraps of food, for enforcing control over younger ones. Survivors revealed Abigail's psychological tactics. She convinced many they were worthless, abandoned by their families, and deserved their fate. Some older captives, imprisoned for years, initially resisted rescue, conditioned to fear the outside world more than their chains. The investigation exposed Abigail's methods for acquiring victims. She had ties to corrupt officials at poorhouses and orphanages who sold children for profit. She also worked with urban criminals who targeted vulnerable runaways, street orphans, or children unlikely to be missed. Most alarmingly, the records showed the operation was growing. The number of children held had risen, and correspondents hinted at plans for new facilities elsewhere. The discovery at the Hawthorne farm had disrupted a criminal enterprise poised to expand. The breakthrough that fully exposed the network came from an unlikely source. A 15-year-old survivor named Clara, held longer than any other. Unlike most, Clara retained a fierce resilience and a sharp memory. Kidnapped from her family's homestead in Ohio in 1834 at age 8, she recalled her capture vividly. A woman posing as a cousin had lured her with promises of a trip to town, only for Clara to awaken shackled in the Hawthorne cellar. More crucially, she remembered every conversation she overheard between Abigail and visitors to the farm. Clara's testimony revealed the Hawthorne operation as part of a vast network. She recalled Abigail discussing other safe houses where children were held, mentioning names, dates, and details of child shipments between sites. Her information gave authorities their first clear view of the enterprise's scale. Most significantly, Clara described a visit 2 weeks before the discovery. A finely dressed man arrived in a polished carriage with 2 escorts. Clara and 3 other children were brought for inspection. The man examined them like cattle, checking their teeth, strength, and health. He declined to buy, deeming them too worn for his needs, but left a letter detailing his preferences for future purchases. Found among Abigail's papers, the letter specified desired ages, physical traits, and temperaments, treating children as merchandise. Signed J. Rutherford with a return address in Mobile, Alabama, it led authorities to James Rutherford, a wealthy cotton planter who had been buying children for years, supposedly as laborers. The investigation uncovered darker purposes, far worse than the Hawthorne operation. The Rutherford connection unveiled a new horror. Southern planners, it seemed, used the trafficking network to acquire children who could be exploited with impunity. Unlike enslaved individuals, who had minimal legal protections and whose absence might be noticed, trafficked children had no status, no families, and no hope. They were used as laborers, subjects for crude medical experiments, or worse. Purposes investigators left partially undocumented due to their depravity. As the network's scope emerged, the investigation met fierce opposition from powerful figures. Several implicated families wielded political influence and wealth to shield themselves. Threats escalated. Constable Burke received anonymous notes urging him to abandon the case. Deputy Reed was ambushed by masked attackers on a rural road. Dr. Thornton's practice suffered a sudden boycott by prominent clients. The intimidation aimed to suppress the investigation and conceal the network's full reach. The situation grew dire when a 12-year-old survivor, Samuel, who had provided key testimony, vanished from the safe house where he was sheltered. A search yielded nothing, sending a clear warning. Those aiding the investigation faced grave risks. Despite the threats, the probe persisted. Federal marshals bolstered security for witnesses and investigators. Survivors were relocated to fortified sites, and armed guards protected the Hawthorne farm to preserve evidence. The case became a crucible for the American legal system, testing whether justice could prevail against wealthy, connected perpetrators. The investigation reached a breaking point when Abigail Hawthorne was found dead in her cell in the Claiborne County Jail. The official report cited suicide, but the circumstances raised doubts. Abigail was set to testify about the full scope of the trafficking network, including her contacts and buyers. Her death silenced the investigation's most vital witness, crippling efforts to unravel the broader conspiracy. The suspicious nature of Abigail's death sent ripples of fear through the investigation team. If powerful forces could eliminate such a key figure, no one involved was safe. The probe had exposed a criminal enterprise so vast and connected that it threatened some of the South's most influential families. Just as the investigation teetered on collapse under threats and violence, a surprising turn shifted the tide. A former employee of James Rutherford, driven by guilt, came forward with evidence that cracked the case open. The employee, Isaac Holt, had served as an overseer on Rutherford's Alabama plantation and possessed intimate knowledge of the children bought from the Hawthorne network. Holt brought documents proving the link between the Hawthorne operation and Southern buyers. More crucially, he had seen what became of many of the children sold to plantation owners. His testimony provided the missing pieces, exposing the full horror inflicted on America's most defenseless. Isaac Holt's testimony before a federal grand jury in Knoxville became one of the most harrowing accounts in American legal history. Holt, a grizzled man in his late 30s with a haunted demeanor, had worked for Rutherford for 12 years. What he revealed about the fate of the Hawthorne children stunned even investigators who thought they'd grasped the operation's depravity. Holt described how Rutherford's plantation ran dual systems. The main estate relied on enslaved labor for cotton, following the brutal but standard Southern model. However, Rutherford had also created what Holt called the testing grounds, a secluded compound where trafficked children were held for purposes unrelated to farming. Children from the Hawthorne network were subjected to medical experiments conducted by Rutherford and associates, including 2 doctors from Mobile's Medical Institute. These experiments tested human endurance, drug effects, and disease progression, treating the children as mere specimens. Holt's most damning evidence was Rutherford's meticulous records, documenting the children's reactions to treatments, survival rates under extreme conditions, and the course of deliberately introduced diseases. The records revealed systematic torture masked as science. Holt testified that at least 32 children from the Hawthorne network had been sold to Rutherford over the years. Only 3 survived long enough to be sold onward. The rest perished from experiments, starvation, or the grueling conditions in the testing grounds, their bodies buried in unmarked graves in a swampy corner of the estate. Holt also detailed the wider network of buyers, having attended meetings where Rutherford negotiated with other planners, merchants, and even a Tennessee state senator. These discussions revealed a trafficking web spanning the nation, with buyers seeking children for varied, horrific purposes. The most shocking revelation came when Holt recounted a gathering in autumn 1839. Rutherford hosted what he called a showcase for prospective buyers from across the South. The event, designed to display the children's quality and versatility, was so grotesque that several grand jurors recoiled. Children were forced to demonstrate labor skills, endure punishments to prove compliance, and showcase their suitability for exploitation. Buyers examined them like livestock, testing their resilience and placing orders for specific types. The event unfolded with the cold efficiency of a market auction that Holt's testimony also exposed the network's financial scale. Prices for children varied by age, health, and purpose, with younger, more malleable ones fetching higher sums. Children with unique traits or skills commanded premiums. The network's transactions totaled an estimated $200,000, a fortune in 1841. Using Holt's information, federal marshals and local authorities launched coordinated raids across the South. Striking plantations, warehouses, and holding sites in secrecy to prevent evidence destruction, they rescued over 90 additional children and seized records documenting the network's operations, including ledgers, letters, and sale logs. The raids led to the arrests of James Rutherford, the 2 mobile doctors, and a Tennessee senator, among others. The evidence revealed a trafficking network active for over 35 years, involving dozens of key players and hundreds of victims. Its organization was unprecedented for the era. The medical experiments were documented in excruciating detail. Children infected with diseases, subjected to toxins, or operated on without anesthesia, treated as disposable for the sake of knowledge. Corruption underpinned the network. Bribed officials at orphanages and poorhouses supplied children, judges falsified adoption papers, and some sheriffs suppressed evidence or intimidated witnesses. The legal battles that followed spanned years, hampered by the case's complexity and the defendant's wealth and connections. Many key figures evaded conviction through legal loopholes or influence. Yet the public exposure of the Hawthorne case had far-reaching effects beyond the courtroom. It spurred the first federal laws against child trafficking and abuse, prompted reforms in orphanage oversight, and established protections for vulnerable children. The Hawthorne case took nearly 6 years to resolve fully, but its societal impact was immediate. Public outrage, fueled by detailed newspaper coverage, mixed horror with resolve to prevent future atrocities. Entire editions of papers in Nashville, Mobile, and beyond were dedicated to the investigation's findings. The 42 children rescued from the Hawthorne cellar faced a grueling recovery. Most, captive for years, had no memory of life before their ordeal. They required extensive medical and psychological care to relearn basic human trust. Many bore lifelong physical and emotional scars. Clara, the 15-year-old whose testimony had been pivotal, became a quiet symbol of resilience as her story spread. Overwhelmed by attention, she was placed with a Methodist family in Ohio, where she found the calm needed to heal. Clara lived to 68, marrying and raising children, but never speaking publicly of her trauma after the trial. Amos Hawthorne, captured during the initial raid, was convicted of kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder. He was hanged in Knoxville on March 22, 1844, before a crowd of over 2,500. Witnesses reported his final words as a confession of his sins and a plea for the children's forgiveness. James Rutherford's trial gripped the nation, exposing the rot within Southern elite society. His records of torture and murder shocked even jaded observers. Convicted of multiple murders, his death sentence was delayed by appeals and political interference, prolonging the victims' families' agony. James Rutherford died in prison in 1846, reportedly from a stroke, though whispers persisted that he was poisoned by allies fearing further revelations. The two doctors from Mobile's Medical Institute, complicit in the experiments, were stripped of their licenses and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Their convictions prompted new regulations on medical research and human subject treatment. The institute itself faced a scandal that nearly shuttered it, as evidence emerged that other faculty knew of the illicit experiments but stayed silent. The investigation's most exasperating challenge was the number of powerful figures who evaded justice despite damning evidence. Several wealthy planners fled to South America before arrests could be made. Others leveraged political ties to dodge prosecution or secure lenient sentences that belied their crime's gravity. A Tennessee senator, a major network client, faced only a legislative reprimand, escaping criminal charges entirely. Financial probes revealed the trafficking network's immense profits. Abigail Hawthorne alone had amassed over $9,000 in gains across her 25-year operation, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. Much of this wealth was untraceable, funneled into legitimate businesses or hidden accounts. The Hawthorne cabin became a grim symbol of the uncovered horrors. Seized by the government, it was sold at auction, but no one would inhabit a place steeped in such evil. The cabin was razed in 1848, its cellar filled with stone and sealed forever. A small memorial garden was created to honor the children who perished, though most of their names remained unknown. The case sparked sweeping child welfare reforms. Tennessee enacted America's first comprehensive child protection laws, mandating oversight of orphanages and background checks for those caring for multiple children. Other states followed, laying the groundwork for modern child welfare systems. The federal government passed new statutes on interstate crimes and human trafficking, addressing the jurisdictional gaps exposed by the Hawthorne case. These laws expanded federal marshals' authority to tackle trafficking, setting precedents for future criminal justice advancements. Most significantly, the case reshaped public consciousness about child vulnerability and the need for systemic safeguards. The idealized image of benevolent individuals caring for orphans gave way to a sobering recognition of the need for oversight and legal protections. The phrase "another Hawthorne case" became a cautionary shorthand for potential abuse in settings involving defenseless children. Dr. Caleb Thornton, the physician who had unwittingly aided the Hawthorne operation, devoted his later years to child welfare. He opened free clinics for orphaned and abandoned children and championed medical ethics reforms to prevent doctors from being exploited by criminals. His writings on ethical practice were deeply shaped by his role in the case. Constable Nathaniel Burke, who spearheaded the initial probe, was appointed a federal marshal and became a pioneer in investigating crimes against children. His detailed reports on the Hawthorne case became essential training material for law enforcement nationwide. The survivors' stories, emerging over years, illuminated both human resilience and the enduring toll of systematic abuse. Some, like Clara, built relatively stable lives with extensive support. Others grappled with mental illness, substance abuse, or health issues tied to their captivity. A few never recovered, succumbing young to complications from their ordeal. The network's correspondence, preserved as evidence, fueled further investigations for decades. Letters from the Hawthorne cellar referenced other operations, victims, and perpetrators. Some leads yielded convictions. Others hit dead ends or lacked sufficient evidence due to time's passage. The case's most haunting realization was that the Hawthorne operation was merely one thread in a vast tapestry of exploitation woven through American history. Similar networks had operated undetected across the country, trading children like commodities, enabled by inadequate legal and social protections. The case underscored the community's role in preventing such horrors. Pine Hollow's residents, who had lived beside one of America's most horrific crime scenes for 25 years, wrestled with guilt and introspection. How had they missed the signs? Could vigilance have spared the suffering? These questions sparked national conversations about communities' duty to protect their most vulnerable. The Hawthorne case became a stark warning against accepting explanations without scrutiny, prioritizing privacy over accountability, or equating respectable facades with moral integrity. Its legacy transcended immediate reforms, providing a trove of documentation, letters, ledgers, and testimonies for historians, criminologists, and reformers. The case remains a lens for understanding systemic evil's ability to thrive in seemingly ordinary settings. Ultimately, the Hawthorne family's reign of terror ended not through advanced detective work, but through the bravery of ordinary individuals. Ezekiel Ramsey's choice to report the screams he heard, Constable Burke's decision to heed community concerns, and Clara's courage to testify despite her trauma dismantled one of America's most heinous criminal enterprises. The cellar where 42 children were found chained has been sealed for nearly 2 centuries, but their suffering echoes as a call for vigilance, compassion, and justice that if this story has sent shivers down your spine, you understand why these dark chapters of American history must never fade. The horrors of places like the Hawthorne farm deepen our grasp of how evil can lurk behind polished exteriors. Share this tale with a friend who thrives on chilling mysteries, hit that like button to support our storytelling, and subscribe to uncover more hidden truths. Let's explore together what other secrets lie buried in America's past.